Therefore, in deciding whether this is a good investment or not, the question is very simple. Does the intrinsic value far exceed the total purchase price? In this case, the answer is no. The answer is no. Now, let's assume that the intrinsic value was greater. The next question would then be, if the intrinsic value was 600,000, the question for you would be, how much margin of error or how much margin of safety would you allow in your calculations before you get to the final figure you would pay for the property? Margin for error or margin of safety is simply to account for biases, to account for errors in your calculation, but also to account for all the political, economic, market changes and developments that could occur. We've assumed 5% growth, but we know that even the economy does not grow at 5%. Sometimes it grows at 2, sometimes it grows at 1, sometimes it goes negative. Property prices, likewise, and properties cannot grow at a constant rate forever. So it will be cyclical. So the margin for error, or the margin of safety, is to allow for, in many ways, your inefficiencies as an investor. So if it was 600,000, you might say, based on the market cycle, or where we are in the market cycle, that a 20% margin for error would be sufficient. This would then mean that you would deduct from this 600,000 20%, and you would say, I would only purchase this property if my total cost is 480,000. Let's go back to these two costs. We keep this constant. This is 20,000. You then say, if I allow for 20,000 for my cost for purchase, then I am only willing to pay 460,000 for this property that has been listed for 500, based on the assumption that estimated intrinsic value is 600. This is just an example of what to do. I'll give you a different way very quickly of arriving at the liquidation value. Just for those of you who are thinking, well, I'd have no intentions of selling the property. I'd like to keep it. At the start of today's session, I made reference to this word, going concern. This means that the value and the cash flow will continue in perpetuity, or at least for the foreseeable future. Rather than use the liquidation value at year number 10, you would simply say, at year number 10, I would assume that the cash flow, which I have been generating, will continue. At year number 10, you have cash flow of 9.936. You would simply say, I've allowed this property to grow at 5% for 10 years. But I have to now recognize that it might have been in a high growth location. However, it cannot continue to grow at 5% in perpetuity. Otherwise, it would outstrip the entire economy. So I would allow my growth rate to go from 5% down to the growth rate of what I consider to be the long-term growth rate of the economy. You make a choice. You might decide that that is 2%. You might decide that that is 1.5%. You might even decide that I would like to be very conservative, and therefore I will not allow or I will not include a growth rate going forward. This means to apply the going concern approach, you would take the cash flow in year number 10, you grow it 1 year forward, growth rate, and then you divide it by the difference between your discount rate and your growth rate. In this case, it would be 9.936 times, let's assume we're using 2, it will be 1.02 divided by, remember what your discount rate was, it was 7%. 7% minus 2%. This is 5%. So, go back to our calculator, 1.9936 times 1.2 divided by 0.05. You would say this would be my discount rate in the future. Sorry, but this would be the value of my going concern in the future. Now you have to be careful here, because by using this approach, what you've said and what you've suggested is that the property will continue to cash flow in perpetuity. And if it does so in perpetuity, then it might be a good investment. Now, let's make some comparisons. We assumed here 5% growth rate up until year number 10, and then you would sell the property at 814,000. We're saying here that if you were going to check the value of the property based on its cash flow only, you were saying if you bought the property with equity only, your money and no debt, this liquidation value or the terminal value is only worth 202,000, because the cash flow it's creating or generating in the future is not that great. So this 202,000, if you added this to all of the 10-year cash flow, which was 96, you would have 96.45 plus 202.69. You would say it's 299. So call this 300,000. So you would say that the value of this property, its intrinsic value, is only 300,000. Now, can you see the contrast between both options? It's huge. Why is this so low? Well, let me share with you something. The reason it's so low is because you've allowed your property to grow at 5% for 10 years, and then you've suddenly dropped it down to 2%. That's the first. So it means your cash flow in the future is not growing at a considerable rate. In addition to that, you've used equity to finance your investment going forward. And that is the big difference. At equity, you're paying 5% as your cost of capital. If, on the other hand, you decide that from year number 10, you would get a mortgage and you would use debt at a 10% equity plus 90% loan, your cost of capital will be 0.035, which would mean that from this point in time, you could change your discount rate. So it would mean that you would have 1.02, looking at these, divided by 0.0385 less. So just playing around with numbers, so you could just have an understanding of how these calculations need to be considered. 9.936 times 1.05, 02 rather, divided by the difference between 0.0385 less 2. You would say this becomes 47,000, which, if you were to add this to all the cash flow in that 10-year period, you would say that the total amount would be plus 644,000. Let me bring all of them closely together. in a way that you can remember. What we're saying here is this. If you just simply assume that you will take all the cash flow that the building will generate, and when it gets to year number 10, after year number 10, you would sell the property. And you're assuming that up until when you sell the property, the property value would have increased by 5% every year. By doing that, what we said is that in year number 11, the present value plus all of the cash flow is generated would be 510,000. With this option, you're assuming a terminal value, and the terminal value is based on a market price. The second approach we use, which we said, no, well, if we assume that we'll just keep holding on to this property in perpetuity, but we only use equity, which would mean that our cost of capital is 7%. We said that the value of this property is only 300,000. Number 3, we said, if we assume that we use equity at 7% for the entire duration of the 10-year period, however, from the 11th year, we use debt. So we take out a mortgage in perpetuity, and we assume that mortgage is at 3.5%, but we are borrowing 90% of the value, and 10% is equity. So in other words, what you're saying at this point was, if for whatever reason you could structure this deal in such a way that you went to the bank and you said to the banker, well, the value of the property or the purchase price is 500,000. But in year number 11, I would put 50,000 down, and I'd like you to give me a loan for 450,000. What we're saying here is that the value changes. Why? Because the going concern after year number 10 goes much more. It goes up because you're using much more debt. Your cost of capital is reduced, and therefore we're saying that the value of the property is 644. Now you might be thinking, what does this all mean? I would encourage you to tune in to the subsequent sessions that we will be doing, where I will spend some considerable time talking about financing, how to structure the financing for your property. Why? The reason is simply because the cash flow you generate is significantly dependent on this simple equation that we've used. It depends on the cash flow. It also depends on the growth rate every year. So the question is, how fast will the cash flow in that area you're buying a property grow? But it also depends on the discount rate or the cost of capital, the risk associated with that investing. Now, can you see that there is a deviation, and there are 3 different potential values? This brings me to one of the most important things that I should state. The intrinsic value of an asset is estimated. It's not precise. It has to be estimated. The reason it's not precise is because there are certain factors, both quantitative and qualitative, that you, the investor, do not have complete control over. Therefore, in calculating the intrinsic value of an asset, you should be very careful not to simply choose one number, because it depends on so many factors, and you're making a decision in the present, and all of the knowledge we have about the future is unknown. They're simply opinions. And in order to protect yourself, you have to allow for that margin of error that I mentioned, or margin of safety, for errors in your calculations and errors in your assumptions. So that is intrinsic valuation. You, the investor, you get to choose which approach you would use. Now, in the next session that I will do, I will talk about the second and the third approaches, which is where you look at the construction cost and the comparisons approach, in other words, pricing. And the intention is simply whenever you want to buy a property, you want to do the intrinsic valuation because it gives you a reality check on how much cash flow the asset will give you. And you should be paying based on how much cash flow the asset will generate. But you want to also check and see whether the cost of construction validates or invalidates whatever assumptions you've used. And finally, you want to do a comparison because there are some times when the cost of construction goes too high and there are times when it becomes too low. Likewise, there are times when a relative comparison with other assets on the same street go too far, and sometimes they become a little bit too dear. I hope that has been useful, and I really hope I haven't confused you. But I believe if you stick around and you allow the two other sessions to present themselves to you, I believe you would understand much better why simply making a purchase decision on the market price is very risky. I believe by the time we discuss these two options, and more importantly, by the time we discuss the financing, in other words, how to package and finance your investment, you would have a better understanding of what it takes to estimate the value of a property you're trying to buy. I hope it's been useful.